I'm going to kick us off if that's all right. It's lovely to see everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's exciting to be kicking off another challenge on the Common Futures platform. To our new members, welcome. It's lovely to have you with us. My name's Ben Horton, and I'm the project lead at Chatham House for Common Futures Conversations. And we're delighted that you have joined us in this autumn. It's been a crazy year, obviously, in the world with COVID-19 and everything. And despite all of the disruption, we've had some absolutely amazing discussions through the CFC platform on a range of different topics. And I think this topic, this idea of how we move from protest movement to policy change, is something that just feels particularly relevant this year after everything that we've seen. I'm not really going to talk any more than that until the breakout sessions that are happening later, but I will just hand you over now to our colleague Max Frass, who will be chairing this event. And thank you very much for joining us.
And I can now introduce Catherine Fieschi, who is the founder and director of Counterpoint, is a UK-based political advisory organization, is an author and an expert on European politics, populism, and contemporary forms of mobilization. And she'll be talking to us today on the key issues related to protest movements and how those can be transformed into policy change. Catherine, over to you. I think you're still on mute. Let me see if we can.
That's it.
That's all right.
There we go. And I'm closing everything. Hello. Hi, everyone. And thank you very much for asking me to join you. I'm really pleased to be able to kick you off and really pleased to get a glimpse of your questions and, what it is that you're thinking about and how you're formulating them. So I'm going to speak really for a maximum of 15 minutes. I really don't want to take up all of the time, but I thought it would be, I was going to make a few points about how we talk about protest and mobilization, and also how we think of protest as successful or unsuccessful, right? Different kinds of success, different kinds of change. So the first thing that I want to say is that I'm getting a lot of background noise. I don't know if it's just me, but no? Okay, just checking that everybody's on mute. Anyway, so we basically, we keep saying that we're living through strange times, and that, despite the fact that actually, many of us have gone through very strange circumstances of being isolated or in various forms of lockdown and so on and so forth, one of the most striking things is actually, how much protest and how much mobilization there has been. And I think that it's worth pointing out that, a lot of the mobilization, particularly around Black Lives Matter, for example, spilt over almost immediately after the lockdown. And I think it did that for very obvious reasons because of what happened in the United States. But I also think that, it's important that actually, I think we live in a world now where if you keep people out of the public space, if you deprive them, of having access to the public space, actually they resent it much more than potentially they used to resent it, right? So as soon as there's an opportunity to be in the streets, they will be in the streets. Having said that, I think that we've been seeing this strange world for a long time, right? And in many ways, I would say that the protests that we're seeing today, whenever we have to hark back to the kinds of protests we're seeing, we go back to 2011 and we go back to the Arab Springs. And in part because of the role that social media played. And in a sense, we kind of, we've been thinking that had a very, made a qualitative difference in the nature of the protest and also the way in which people mobilized and organized. It's really interesting to think back, though, at the fact that actually we've been seeing this kind of mobilization emerge. We've been seeing, the first kinds of uses of mobile phones, as early as 19, the mid 1990s, protests against the WTO, the stuff we saw in Seattle, the stuff we saw in Genoa. Those were the kind of the murmurings of this new kind of protest where people, were able to organize in the streets so much more seamlessly, and actually kind of escape authorities in ways that they hadn't been able to do. So I think that, we see a shift from, the protests that we saw in the 1960s to what we see emerging in the 1990s, to a kind of evolution that we see, from 2010 onwards. But I think it's also important to remember that that these are part of a great global evolution of how people protest and how they make their voices heard. And even though some of these movements look different from one another, there are great similarities. And even though some of these movements may look similar to one another, there are huge contextual differences that we need to keep in mind. So I just want to make a few quick points here. One is that I think it's important, if we ask ourselves, about change and policy change, that actually movements go through different phases, right? And that obviously issues go through different phases. So, you can have a protest movement whose immediate goal isn't necessarily policy change immediately. It might be just consciousness raising, right? Simply, making sure that people are aware of this issue, in a way that they previously weren't. And here it's about, potentially gauging, it's about making the issue known. And then you move potentially into a second phase. And that second phase potentially is also, about finding out who's on your side and who's not on your side, right? Gauging your potential allies. So your potential allies in your movement or around your movement, but also potentially also your allies in the policy world, right? So, I mean, this could take various forms in our contemporary world. It might be that somebody that you didn't expect, retweets what's going on, either with approval or with disapproval. So here too, you've got consciousness raising, issue signaling, signaling of, injustice or inequality or a particular situation, building your allies, being able to actually think through who your allies are. And I think that this is it's a particularly important phase, but it's always very difficult to know how you would evaluate success, right? Or how you would evaluate change. You haven't yet changed anything. And yet somehow by creating these alliances, you're really setting, these people are really setting the building blocks of further change going forward. And then I think, if we look at Black Lives Matter, I think it's, again, it's a very important, it's a really important almost case study, because, we tend to forget that Black Lives Matter has been around since 2013, right? And there's been, there have been a lot of marches, and it's become very much, something that's become part of the American fabric of the protest landscape, if you like. But I think what's really important about the marches that we saw and the protests that we saw, over the spring, and particularly, in late June and July, I think that what we saw there is the capacity, because of the horrific act that, triggered this wave of protest, is actually the capacity to diversify the coalition, right? And the capacity to diversify the allies. And here, even though, you could argue that it's a movement, that, hasn't necessarily yet achieved policy change, it has put policy proposals on the table, right? And I think that this is, even being able to agree that there are policy proposals, that are going forward is very important. And one of the reasons that I think it's so important is that because often when we look at social movements, and then the organized, and then there's there's the moment where they are a movement and a protest, and then there's a moment where they have to evolve into an organization, right? That's a very delicate moment, and it's often a moment where some within the movement will argue that any kind of organizational transformation or institutionalization will, in a sense, make it less radical, potentially make the movement lose its soul, et cetera, make it more bureaucratic, make it, in a sense, less appealing as a protest by making it more appealing as an organization, right? But whereas others would argue that actually protest has reached its limits, right? And that actually you need to set up an organization to take it forward in terms of making policy recommendations. We saw this in Occupy a little bit, right? Where essentially at one point people started to say, well, it's great that we're sitting around in squares and having these discussions, but actually we're not putting forward, policy proposals. And I think if we look at if we look at Black Lives Matter, one of the really miraculous things is that it's not necessarily thought of as an organization or a bureaucratic organization, but it has managed to articulate some really, some really quite cogent policy proposals about how you fund the police, how you train the police, how you promote the police, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is, I think these are different stages in the movement, and that the movements need to be judged by what stage they're at in terms of success. And sometimes it's about policy change. Sometimes it's about allies. Sometimes it's about giving yourself the tools to transform yourself into a different kind of organization that eventually becomes successful to deliver policy. I think the second point I want to quickly make is, the interesting interplay between the global and the local. At this point, right? And this is why, to some extent, I think the 2011, the Arab Springs in 2011 were so, extraordinarily powerful, and also powerful for those of us who study these movements. It's that, there was, and one of you mentioned this in your contributions, mentioned the kind of domino effect, right? And that domino effect was in part due to the role of social media. It was in part due also to the role sometimes, of shared language, which also helps. And I think that, it was our first glimpse, to some extent, of a protest that felt as though it had a kind of more than a national reach, right? It wasn't, yes, it was about toppling certain regimes, but it also felt like, a wave of young people in a particular part of the world who had just had it up to here with the kind of impunity, that a particular political class and political elite had enjoyed for a long time. So I think that one of the things that it's interesting to think about always is that tension or that pull, between the force and the capacity to capture the imagination by a protest that feels, that feels global, that transcends boundaries, right? The fact that it transcends boundaries gives it a very particular kind of hold on people's imaginations, right? It gives it a hold on the imagination of journalists, but it also gives it a hold on the imagination of those leaders who can basically see the dominoes falling, and in a sense getting closer to home. So that's a very particular kind of power, but it should never be forgotten that actually, the success of these movements is in part dictated by actually very defined and very different kinds of political and legal and institutional contexts, right? And I think that this is one of the issues about how we organize in the early 21st century, and how we're successful in the 21st century, is to try and be able to conjugate both of these, right? To kind of roar with the power of a global protest, and something that feels that it has a planetary force behind it, and at the same time be able to effect change in a very locally defined context, right? What political scientists refer to as the political opportunity structure, right? in other words, the institutions that you need to be able to influence in order to make policy change, right? And, the military might play a different role. The courts might play a different role. The government opposition might play a different role, et cetera, et cetera. The media may be structured completely differently, right? Whereas in one country, you might want to pursue change through the courts, in another country, you might want to pursue change through different kinds of pressure tactics, even if in fact you may be espousing the same cause of gender equality, racial equality, class equality, right? But it always needs to be tailored. And I think that so here, we get into I think one of the areas that's possibly one of the most interesting, and that is the nature of the tactics that you would use, right? And some of you in your various contributions have raised, the idea of extreme tactics versus non-extreme tactics, which is first of all, it's an interesting question in terms of what works and when, right? And here, I think we need to keep in mind again that what might work at a particular phase of a movement may not work in a different phase of the movement, right? So it might work to begin with to be quite extreme, but then as you build alliances, you might actually alienate some of your allies if you stick to some of the very extreme tactics. But it's also a really important question to ask, simply because, what it asks us to look at what we think a situation warrants, right? And what's interesting there is that different people might actually, reply to this in a very different way. So for example, Extinction Rebellion might say, of course we're going to use extreme tactics because, this is an existential threat. And unless we do this, nobody's going to pay attention. Whereas, others might counter that actually, there's still time to change policy on climate, whereas actually, if you look at what's happening, in terms of the persecution of African Americans by the police, that is a much more existential and immediate threat, right? So I think the calculation about what is immediate, what is existential, is a really important discussion in these movements about what tactics warrant things. But more to the point, I think also, and it brings us to my concluding points here, it is that I think that, when we think of how to affect policy change, if we think of, protest and then organization and then policy formulation and then, bringing these policy formulations to policymakers, right? One of the really successful movements that we can point to over, say, the past 30 years, I think, is the LGBT movement, right? You could argue that the LGBT movement has been one of the most successful in terms of actually, creating not just cultural change, but actually cultural change reflected in policies, whether it's, same-sex marriage or whether it's about, the apportioning of bank accounts or insurance after one of the partner dies. I mean, very concrete policy change in that area. And I've always been fascinated by the fact that this is, the change, if you think of the LGBTQ movement, right? The change feels as though there was nothing, very slow, very slow, very slow. And then all of a sudden there was a tipping point, right? All of a sudden, you felt like every country in the world was ratifying, not every country, alas, but, very many countries in the world were ratifying, this in their parliaments. There was a kind of a momentum all of a sudden. And one of the things that's really interesting, I think, is that not because I think anybody changed their mind, but I think that there was a change of tactic when it came to actually affecting policy change. And that is that it became very obvious that if you were going to approach policymakers, on behalf of these causes and try and encourage them to make policy change, you needed to be able to give them a narrative that they could work with, right? And so, for having done this kind of appeal myself, not particularly on LGBTQ issues, but on other issues. There's a moment where you realize that actually signifying your, your difference or your plight, or, or the uniqueness of your issue that needs to be brought to the fore, that's great in terms of consciousness raising. But that at one point when you need to convince a policymaker, assuming you can convince a policymaker, right, and that you're not just trying to block terrible constitutional change, for example, as one saw in Poland, in terms of the judiciary, right? But if you are trying to convince a policymaker, then I think that often you make their life a lot easier by giving them a way to depict this as something that is for the common good, right? So one of the key things that I think, LGBTQ movement did was that they went from arguing that they were different, right, to arguing that they wanted the same things as everybody else, right? So, we want equality of access to marriage, for example, because actually everyone else has, and actually this is this makes it easier for a policymaker to argue that you're not making an exception, you're actually enlarging a circle of policy. And I mean, this is one example, and, obviously things vary again enormously from one constitutional and institutional context to the next, but it is something to keep in mind, right? That even a policymaker who's on your side needs to convince other people. And the way for them to convince other people is to give them a narrative that they can work with, and that is not a narrative of exceptionalism, but often that is a narrative that extends, to a shared constituency with, his or her colleagues, his or her bosses, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is just something, to keep in mind. When is it appropriate to be really in your face and very, quite extreme and exclusive in your demands? And when is it appropriate to actually start to couch this in terms where you're actually going to facilitate the life of the policymaker by giving them, an easier narrative to work with, right? I'm going to stop here.
I'm sure there will be a lot of follow-up, and obviously we'll keep you appraised on the ideas that were developed. So you will hear from us in due course. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.